You found Ask Alice. You found Ask Alice, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the societal currents shaping our lives. I'm your host, Alice, and together we'll explore the often unseen forces at play. We'll examine cutting-edge research, dissect the data, and most importantly, if you're seeking to understand what's shaping our society, this is the place.
Okay, so let's unpack this. You sent us a question looking into federal buildings under the Trump administration.
Right. And specifically asking about this idea that maybe Congress members and other government officials weren't allowed to enter.
Exactly that point. And, well, digging into the sources you provided, it became pretty clear right off the bat.
Yeah, there wasn't any kind of broad, sweeping ban like that. No general keep-out sign for officials across the board. The material just doesn't support that general idea.
No. But that's where it actually gets really interesting, isn't it? What the sources do show is, well, much more specific.
Definitely more nuanced and often quite contentious situations regarding access and security back then.
So, not a blanket ban, but the sources point towards, definite challenges, specific kinds of restrictions.
Exactly. We see specific examples where congressional oversight seems to have been, blocked.
Blocked. How so?
Well, the sources mention things like Congressman Jason Crow, for instance, being denied entry for weeks.
Weeks. To where?
To an immigration detention facility. This was after reports of disease outbreaks surfaced.
Okay, wow. And was that an isolated thing?
It seems not entirely. There's another mention, pretty concerning, of representatives trying to do their oversight job at a different facility and apparently being threatened with arrest.
Arrest? On what grounds?
Well, based on what the material describes as an unsubstantiated claim by officials there.
Huh. But don't members of Congress have a right to access these places?
They absolutely do. The sources are quite clear on this. There are explicit statutory rights for unannounced oversight visits, like to DHS facilities.
So threatening arrest. That seems to fly right in the face of the law. And maybe even agency rules.
That's what the material strongly suggests, yes. It points less to a simple mix-up and more towards a potential challenge to legislative oversight itself, maybe trying to limit those checks and balances.
Okay, so that's Congress. But you mentioned other restrictions, too, not just for officials.
Right. The sources also flag something interesting about private citizens, or rather specific private companies.
Which ones?
It mentions certain private law firms like WilmerHale and Paul Weiss. There were apparently executive orders directing agencies to limit access for their employees to federal buildings.
Limit access for lawyers. What was the reason given?
The justifications cited, as described in these sources, were pretty broad. Things like their work wasn't aligned with American interests, or even accusations of blatant discrimination.
And these firms, were they involved in anything specific?
The sources note they were involved in lawsuits challenging administration policies at the time.
I see. So the executive orders use these kind of sweeping phrases, maybe blurring lines by citing national security or American interests.
It seems that way based on the documentation. It suggests executive power being used not just against, say, political opponents in government, but potentially against private groups seen as adversarial, too. Raises questions, you know?
Definitely raises questions about boundaries. And then there's the contrast you mentioned earlier, the way federal force was used.
Ah, yes. This is maybe the most striking part detailed in the sources. A real difference in the response to protests in Los Angeles versus the response to the January 6th attack on the Capitol.
Tell us about L.A. first. What happened there?
The material describes a very swift, very aggressive deployment. Thousands of National Guard, even Marines, sent into Los Angeles.
For what?
Against protests related to immigration. And significantly, the sources say this happened over the objections of Gavin Newsom. It even led to legal challenges from California.
Wow. So a strong federal response despite state objections.
Very strong. And the language used, according to the reports, was quite harsh, comparing protesters to an invasion threatening serious force.
Okay. Now contrast that with January 6th. What do the sources say there?
A very different picture. The sources focus on security failures and, critically, a delayed federal response.
Delayed how?
Well, they note President Trump issued no order or formal request for National Guard troops while the attack on the Capitol was actually happening.
No order during the attack itself.
And later, the sources point out, he pardoned hundreds of the rioters. He even apparently described January 6th as a beautiful day.
Which the reports highlight as, well, a stark contrast to how protesters were described in L.A., right?
Exactly. Stark contrast. And This inconsistency, according to the sources, is key. It suggests maybe not a consistent policy on public safety.
But maybe more of a selective application of law and order.
That's what the sources imply, yes. That the response seemed to depend on whether the people involved were seen as politically aligned with the administration or not.
Okay, so let's just recap the main takeaways from the material you looked at for us.
Sure. First, no simple blanket ban on officials entering federal buildings. That wasn't really the case.
Right. Instead, we saw specific instances where congressional oversight was seemingly denied at certain facilities.
Yes, despite their legal right to be there. Then, targeted restrictions on private law firms via executive orders, using kind of broad justifications.
And finally, this really stark contrast in deploying federal force.
Yeah.
Aggressive in L.A. against protesters, even over state objections.
Versus delayed and seemingly politically influenced during the January 6th Capitol attack.
So the pattern suggested by the reports isn't consistent policy, but maybe something more like selective enforcement. Political influence shaping security decisions.
That appears to be the implication drawn from the material provided.
And these events, as the sources describe them, they really do raise some fundamental questions, don't they? About the balance of power, state rights, the independence of security forces.
You certainly do. Which leads to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to consider as you process all this.
Okay.
How can we ensure that the application of security, of law enforcement, remains consistently impartial? How do we make sure it's not swayed